book, Radhika.
Thank you, John, and thank you all very much for coming to this meeting. The title that we have given to what is, in a sense, a kind of combination book launch and lecture is The End of US Dominance and the Alternatives to Austerity. And to me, and if you were to read this book, you will find that these two themes are intimately linked. In a variety of ways, and the intimate linkage is something I talk about in the book. But, and as will become clear to you as I go along, so let me just basically start by telling you a little bit about why I ended up writing this book, why I think it's relevant today, and give you a little bit of a flavor of what I talk about in it. So, basically, if you think about it, we are living at the moment in a very, very long crisis. At the last session, Alan pointed out that we are in the 7th year of a very long drawn-out crisis, which seems to be nowhere near going away. However, there's one very big thing, and there are many problems, of course. The Queen, of course, pointed out that the economists were not able to figure out exactly what was wrong. They hadn't predicted a crisis. There are many other things as well which have not been predicted, in particular at the level of the world order. Indeed, there's one thing that this book is about. In a sense, if I could certainly interest you with this book in a very brief sentence, geopolitical economy is about what makes the world order tick. Not just in terms of geopolitics, which is something that's considered to be somehow separate from the economy, nor in terms of nor alone in terms of the dynamics of the economy, but the way in which they are connected together. Hence the title, Geopolitical Economy, and the title also reaches back in intellectual history to recover the tradition of political economy up to and including Marx and Engels, and it tries to work out from that exactly how they would have understood the international level, the world level of capitalism. So that's basically what it's about. And one of the things that I find very interesting is that since the crisis broke, we have been living in, or rather it has become very clear that the crisis has created something called multipolarity. And if there's one simple way in which one can depict what it's about, is that, contrary to what many people say, it's not a global crisis. The crisis has hit the Western industrialized countries very severely. They remain mired in a long-term stagnation, while a very large number of developing countries, led by China, continue to grow. And there are many, there are contrasts between growth rates, but there are also some other really interesting things going on. For example, the international relationships, international economic relationships, had for a long time been basically what had been given to us by the era of imperialism, and they took the form of hub and spoke relationships. So third world countries or poor countries had their trade relations primarily with rich countries, typically or very often the mother country, the former colonizing country. However, today it is becoming increasingly clear, and has been so, that these emerging economies or developing countries, or whatever you want to call them, are increasingly trading with one another. They are leaving the Western countries out. Now, so this also shows that basically the center of gravity of the world economy is moving away from the West. So that's one of the things that multipolarity means. Now, if you look at what's being said in academic life in terms of trying to understand the world order, you have a discipline called international relations, and a part of it is also a sub-discipline called international political economy. However, neither of these ways of understanding the world economy has prepared us for this moment. For the last 2 decades, and still to some extent, they remain mired in one or another of the major paradigms, if one may call them, major perspectives on the world economy, which we may call globalization and empire. And if you believe globalization, then you should find it very bewildering that the present crisis is not global. If you believe in empire, you should find it very, very hard to believe that rather than the old scenario where the United States sneezes and the rest of the world catches pneumonia, it's the other way around today. Okay? So what we are looking at is a very, very different scenario, and what's more, changes like these don't happen overnight. So what I'm trying to say is that the world order was never global. It was not imperial, it was not based on US hegemony. So that's sort of just leading into what I'm trying to say. So in one very big sense, my book is trying to argue that these, what I call cosmopolitan perspectives, perspectives in which the world economy is depicted as though it were a single unit. The fact that it is divided up into nation states is merely an irrelevant fact. Something that we have inherited from history, but it doesn't really matter. It's just decoration. It is not, and that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about, and that's where the alternatives to austerity will come in. But let me proceed in the way that I think best makes sense to me. So why did I write this book? Let me sort of set up the background to this by giving you a couple of anecdotes. Back in 2004, I was asked to be part of a panel on globalization. And there were 3 other speakers, and we all decided that we would meet beforehand so that we had each, about 15 minutes to speak. So we didn't want to overlap very much with each other, so we would discuss with each other what everyone was going to say. So one of my colleagues at this meeting began by saying, well, I'm going to argue that globalization is wonderful. And when the next colleague said, no, how can you say that? I'm going to argue that it's an unmitigated disaster, the worst thing ever visited upon humanity, is causing these problems, blah, blah, etc. And then third colleague, thinking he's very wise, said, and I'm going to argue that whether you like it or not, it's happening. You've heard all these arguments. At that time, here I was sitting there, and I had been developing a different argument, because ever since globalization discourse got going, and most people don't realize this, but it did not get going until the late 1990s. Because once it got going, one felt as though it was always around. But no, it got going in the late 1990s. So ever since the beginning of globalization discourse, I thought, what are these people talking about? What do they mean? The world is becoming, so the world, of course, the capitalist economy is international, but what is the qualitative change they are referring to that requires this new term globalization? Have nation states really become irrelevant? Since when? What exactly happened to make them so? I have been asking these questions, and of course, so have many others, and a few of them, preeminently, for example, Paul Hurst and Graham Thompson, really marshaled the facts, and they pointed out that, look, practically every claim that is made about globalization, whether it is about trade, finance, what have you, I mean, investment, you name it, all of these claims are deeply questionable. Particularly if you want to identify a particular point at which things radically change from the past. So they had already done this, and so I completely agreed with them, and I drank up all this literature, and I said, yes, this is right, this is correct. And then I had some, sort of towards the late 90s, suddenly another question occurred to me. These guys are right, but they're not asking another question that's very important. If it is the case that all these claims about globalization are wrong, why did we suddenly start talking about globalization in the 1990s? Why? What was driving the discourse? So, I had been thinking about this. I had already written one article in which I presented my point, and the point was this. So, to come back to this room in which my colleagues and I were discussing, one saying globalization is wonderful, globalization is terrible, globalization is inevitable whether you like it or not, this unstoppable juggernaut, and I said, well, all right, I'm going to argue that globalization is over. And so this is one perspective that I want to tell you. Now, as I started, and that's basically the story I had already started working on and sort of briefly outlined in an article, was that globalization was a discourse of one particular strategy of the American state to deal with its hegemonic decline. It had once been hegemonic, it was declining. So I started working on this book. I started reading up what I needed to read, trying to find out the facts that I wanted to find. I found a really good way of dealing with all of those things. But as I read more, I realized that I had another task to tackle. Not only was globalization wrong, questionable, and something to be explained, so was empire. And all these ideas that told us that the US was hegemonic. So you may have heard people say the United States is hegemonic. It's got everything wrapped up. Everything that happens in the world is decided in Washington, at the Pentagon, etc., or in Wall Street. I found that this is less and less credible. There are people who still think this. There are other people who will tell you the United States was once hegemonic, today it is in decline. But in my book, I argue that the United States, despite zealous efforts to achieve dominance over the world economy, has consistently failed to do so. That is not to say it has been trying, and in trying, it has visited untold horrors, military, economic, on the world. Please understand, of course, that I use the United States as a shorthand. I don't mean the people of the United States, because one of the other things I show in my book is that they have paid as well. They have paid a high price for the activities that have been pursued by successive US governments. But let's bracket that. So this is some of the background to it. So in this book, the best way of sort of making you familiar with what I'm doing in it is I make 3 arguments. Okay, and the first is the most fundamental. Contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, and unfortunately, by the way, this includes a lot of Marxists. Contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, capitalism is not a purely economic system. It cannot be. It cannot be because it is inherently contradictory and it is inherently unjust. And both of these mechanisms, the injustice/exploitation that it visits upon the working classes, and not to forget, peasantries and other working people around the world, as well as its inherent tendency to crisis, both require that states have to play a central role in managing capitalism. And it has always been thus. And again, this is something that I show in my book by discussing really the limit cases. So, for example, many people say, of course, states are involved in economies, but they say, oh, well, that happens especially with later developing states. So, what do? I show that actually, since this is accepted, I will show you that this is also true of the earliest developing states, particularly the UK. So, and I've discussed many of the ins and outs of this as well. So anyway, my point is that states have been always centrally involved. Now, this is at the domestic level, and we see, of course, various people have pointed this out. Today, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial meltdown, states, of course, stepped in a major way in order to bail out the capitalists. So I'm not suggesting that state involvement is always in the interests of the workers. The workers have to organize and bring the state to account before it will act in their interest. But this is a possibility. The greatest gains of the working class have been made via these means, and even if we want something even more, there is no need to give up on these mechanisms. So the states are involved. Now, at the international level, what this means is that you cannot talk about the world economy as a single whole. A seamless whole in which the existence of states is merely an optional instrument. It is not. It is central, and the way in, so most people think about capitalism spreading around the world as a matter of markets. A small number will actually happen to remember imperialism. But I don't forget imperialism. I mean, in many ways my book is very centrally about imperialism, and it tells you, it has a particular theory about exactly what time is it in the history of imperialism today. What does multipolarity mean for imperialism? But let me just take a step back. What I argue in this book is that therefore if you take into account states as central, and I also show, by the way, that Marx and Engels thought this as well, how do you conceive of the relations between states. And I use a particular expression that Marx uses at the very end of the Globalisation, a short fragment that he wrote on the American economist Henry Carey, in which he uses the expression, the relations of producing nations. And I think that we must reconceive international relations or the world order in terms of the relations of producing nations. And here, and I also argue, and this as Marxists or people interested in Marxism will be interested to know, I also argue that the first theories of international relations were actually Marxist theories. They were those theories that we today refer to as the classical theories of imperialism, the ones that were elaborated by Hilferding, Luxemburg, Bukharin, Lenin, and also I include here, because Lenin relied a great deal on him, the English Social Democrat John Rawls. Okay, so these guys, they were the first people to sit and to scratch their heads and say, okay, why is it that competition for colonies is going up at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century? And they produce theories about it, and if you take an international relations course, the first thing you'll be taught is international relations was born in the aftermath of the First World War, when Wilson pronounced his ideas about, the world order and so on, and eventually, as the Second World War began, realism took over, and etc. This is crap. In reality, what Wilson said was a response to the Bolsheviks and their peace decree, and basically them declaring that you will no longer have the people will no longer tolerate secret treaties, etc. But anyway, my point is the Bolsheviks and all these people, these Marxists, had a fundamental idea, and it's called uneven and command. We know this term, many of us know this term. There's a problem, however. Most people don't really use it, but even those who do, they only focus on one half of it, which is uneven development, and they use it to reinforce ideas about US dominance and Western dominance, generally as though it is an eternal and unshakable fact of life. No, there is also such a thing as combined development, which most of them don't talk about. And when they do, they use the term to refer to those cases, such as that of Russia, but also others where poor countries or backward countries make a transition to socialism. Completely missing from this, but existing in the writings of the classical Marxists, and also in Trotsky's famous chapter 1 of the History of the Russian Revolution, where this is all very succinctly shown or is outlined. There is capitalist combined development, which is state-led contender development, in which a given state or set of states will contest the existing division of labor between those producing high-value goods and those producing low-value goods, and industrialize behind protectionist walls, behind all sorts of state direction. The Americans did it, the Germans did it, and the Japanese did it, and in many ways, the period of inter-imperial rivalry was also, it was inter-imperial rivalry precisely because it was a period of intensifying industrial power between these powers. Britain was no longer alone in dominating the world, no longer the sole industrial power. There were suddenly competing industrial powers. This is what made the moment very competitive. And in many ways, you could argue that this was the first instance of multipolarity. And since then, productive capacity has spread around the world, not through the action of markets, not through the imperialism of the UK, but then passing on the torch to the US and all of this sort of silly thing, which I'll come to in a minute, but rather precisely by the dialectic of uneven and combined development, in which dominant states seek to preserve existing structures of unevenness because they favor the dominance of these dominant states, and contender states challenge them, they contest them. So China today and other emerging economies are simply the latest in a long line of people who have contested existing divisions of labor and spread productive capacity around the world in that sense. And you can't do it without the actions of states. And those people who, one of the sleight of hand that is often made, for example, I've got colleagues who actually imagine that if there is industrialization in a third world country, it must be because of multinationals. No. If you actually look at the statistics, multinationals are responsible for a tiny proportion of gross domestic capital formation for the world as a whole. And within that, bulk of the investment that they make go to other rich countries. They're not good. Yeah, China is an exception, but China is making, even for China, the proportion of foreign investment to total investments, bulk of it is domestically driven. And neoliberalism has tried to make us all forget in the West that the state had played a very central role here, and that's why we are suffering still. But that's the first argument. And by the way, one final proviso in the first argument. Cosmopolitan ideologies, free trade, first and foremost, 19th century free trade ideology which served British dominance, globalization, empire, and the United States' own version of free trade, hegemony stability theory that the United States was hegemonic, as the latest in a succession of such powers. All of these which think of the world economy as a single whole, in which either no state matters or only one state. The fact that there is a plurality of nation states is irrelevant from the point of view of conceiving of the world economy. These cosmopolitan ideologies are the handmaidens of actual dominance of single states, such as that exercised by the United Kingdom, or attempted dominance, which is that exercised by, but that attempted to be exercised by the United States. So these are the ideologies of these attempts, as I was trying to say, or the actual. The second argument then, having set up this background, then the next two arguments should be relatively easy for you to understand. The second argument is directly aimed at the ideas about empire and US hegemony and so on. The dominance of the first industrial capitalist country in the world over the rest of the world economy was inevitable. That's what happens. You are the first to emerge, you dominate the rest. No secret here, no great, this is not a rocket science, anybody can understand. However, it was also unrepeatable. The very conditions that made, that basically brought it to a stop also ensured that no other single power could dominate. Now there are many things involved here. One thing is that the United States, early in the 20th century, the United States had been expansionist throughout its history. You know, it occupied an entire continent, it then reached the Pacific shores, it tried to go beyond, didn't succeed very well. And the fact of the matter was that the world was basically accounted for. And the US was a Johnny-come-lately in the field of imperialism. It saw that actually imperial conquest would be too expensive because wars had become expensive, nationalist resistance was emerging, all of these sorts of things. So what it decided is that it would try to emulate, because it could see British power was waning. It was a very large economy, so you thought, right, if we could try to emulate. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and emulate British dominance, but colonies are too difficult. So we leave out the formal empire stuff. What we are going to do is we are going to try and emulate British dominance by making the dollar the world's money, as sterling had been, and making New York the world's financial center, as London had been. And so this was the project that they set themselves. What they forgot, and I discussed this at some length in my book, very close. What they forgot, of course, is that the colonies were central to the British ability to maintain, to keep sterling as the world's money, because only colonial surpluses gave the British the excess capital that they could export in order to provide the world with liquidity. When the United States turn came, it tried to, and it had the following problem, especially after the Second World War. It's trying to provide the world with liquidity, but it has no capital to export. It's a national economy like any other. If it started exporting capital, where would its growth come from? And it was committed to trying to maintain its relative size. So the alternative was run deficits. But if you ran deficits, then you were inevitably going to face the dilemma which the Belgian economist Robert Triffin made very famous, meaning that if you can run deficits, but that very, you can provide the world with liquidity through those means, but that very way of providing the world with liquidity is going to bring down the value of the economy. This is effectively what brought to an end the initial phase of attempted dollar dominance in 1971. Anyway, I can't go into great detail about this, but the point is that it was unrepeatable. And so since then what you've seen is a series of attempts to reconstitute something like US dominance, dollar dominance in the world. And these series of attempts has taken the form of a series of what I call financializations. You've all heard the term. It's typically used in the singular. But there's a problem with it, because financialization is not the same everywhere. And what's more, I also identify very discrete episodes of financialization. And each one constituted, especially those that were sort of worldwide and centered on the dollar, they constituted another attempt to give the dollar a basis. So the recycling of petrodollars was one, Japanese financing of American deficits was another in the 1980s, the stock market boom in the late 1990s, which was associated with the ideology of globalization, was another, and of course the housing/credit bubble in the last decade was the final one. I also argue that the US dollar is now, I mean, let me put it this way, it's still of course used a great deal, but much less. You can see that in the statistics, and it's on its way out. Whether it goes out over a long period of time or within a short, in a cataclysmic fashion, is anybody's guess. But the dollar is on its way out in a number of different ways. Anyway, another point I would like to make about the second argument, because the third is very brief, is that it was only the wars that made it possible for the United States to even attempt the sort of dominance that it did. Because what did the wars do? The wars, on the one hand, rained destruction on all the rival capitalist economies. On the other hand, so they were going down, but on the other hand, the US economy, as the supplier of war material to these fighting powers, actually increased the size of its economy. So between 1939 and 1945, for example, the same thing happened on a smaller scale in World War I, but this is the most spectacular. The US economy nearly doubled in size. It would not double again for 22 years, even though these 22 years included the so-called golden age of growth. This is the scale of the advantage that the US received from the war, and at the end of the war, the United States basically gave no quarter to anybody who might say you should, all these theories about the US behaving altruistically are a load of claptrap. What it was determined to do at the end of the war is to preserve its relative dominance in the world economy. At that time, thanks to the differential effect of the war in different parts of the world, the US were accounted for nearly half of world production. Can you imagine? I mean, that's a monstrously large size of an economy for any country, right? Anyway, the point is only the wars made it possible for the United States to even attempt to do so. Okay. So this is the second argument. UK hegemony was inevitable. US hegemony, but it was unrepeatable. So US hegemony has actually never really obtained in any meaningful way. What we witnessed instead are a series of vain attempts to do that. And I would suggest today that even those attempts are not possible, whether economically or militarily. And we can discuss that in the discussion, but I will just now state the final argument, because I've been told the time is nearly up. The final argument is very simple, that globalization and empire were the ideologies that accompanied the last two financializations, the last two attempts to give the dollar a financial basis of some kind. Because if you've got to make it liquid, you've got to create a lot of financial activity in that currency. So the first, namely globalization, was based on effectively a bubble in the US stock market, which made lots of people around the world invest in the US stock market. And the bubble was effectively generated by Alan Greenspan, who produced a whole lot of claptrap about the new economy in the United States. And I detail all this in my book. So those of you who are interested in ICT, new economy, etc., will also find the globalization chapter quite interesting, as will those who are interested in globalization per se. Secondly, And at least this phase, at least it generated some kind of investment boom, although it was also highly misallocated investment. But nevertheless, it at least generated investment boom. In the next decade, the moment, as the United States was coming out of the recession created by the breaking up of the dot-com bubble, bursting of the dot-com bubble, the managers of the US economy, and by this point this was more or less confined to the Fed, realized that the only thing that was keeping any kind of growth going in the economy was the rising housing market, which was allowing people to take credit in order to spend. They decided that this was the way of keeping the show of growth going, so they created a new set of discourses about how this was perfectly okay. House prices can indeed go up for a very long time. Greenspan even pretended that you can't really tell if there's a bubble in the housing market. He even preached a theory about how you can't, housing, it's more or less impossible to get a bubble in housing. So all of these, what some people call junk economics, has been produced since that time as well. So this was the second, or the empire was the ideology of the last relatively successful attempt to give the dollar a high liquidity basis. Since that time, since 2008, what's really interesting is that financial flows, international financial flows have collapsed. Believe it or not, they have. This is despite the fact that in the US in particular, the financial sector has been bailed out very handsomely. Okay, that is to say, they have been giving all their money back. They are continuing to speculate. So the recovery is largely powered by that, but it still remains at about 40% of the peak of 2007-2008. So this means that, and at the same time, so this means that basically the liquidity base that the dollar needs is not available in the same way. The dollar's use around the world has been declining, and very importantly, emerging economies are making arrangements to leave the dollar out, more and more, as much as they can, to leave the dollar out of their dealings with, especially other third world countries, but in a variety of different ways, through currency swap arrangements and reserve pooling and what have you, which we can discuss. But I think I'll end there. Thank you very much. Very much for these really very, very excellent and interesting questions, and I'll try and do justice to as many of them as I can, and I guess I will just take them in the order that I received them because that's the easiest, but it may very well be that I'll end up answering some questions that were answered later because they are sort of connected. So the first point was that the euro, in many ways, as part of the idea of US hegemony, we were taught to believe that the United States was particularly hegemonic over Western Europe and its allies. What we forget is that the Western Europeans began treading their path towards creating the euro precisely at the moment when the United States broke the link of the dollar with gold. Because they had got fed up to here of holding valueless dollars. What did they do? They took the first step towards creating the euro, the so-called snake. Basically creating a band within which their currencies would fluctuate as a first step. So the euro is really one of the biggest reasons why there is a massive reduction in the international use of the dollar. This is very, very important to bear in mind. Gold, I think, that's very, look, I personally have thought a great deal about international monetary issues, particularly from a Marxist perspective, but also from a Keynesian perspective. And at the moment, at least, what I think is that, although, of course, gold is not back officially any major currency anyway that we hear of, it does play a role in the international monetary system, which is why the price of gold always rises when you have a major crisis. So, for example, the biggest crisis of the dollar was actually at the end of the 1970s when gold hit $850 an ounce. That in real terms has not been equaled yet, although the gold hit 1800, etc. But if you factor in inflation, we haven't got there yet. So that was the biggest crisis, which then prompted Paul Volcker to administer his Volcker shock and what have you. I think that definitely there are many ideas, and I'm personally working in and writing new stuff on these matters. Keynes went to Bretton Woods, as you know, as the head of the British delegation. This was the conference at which the shape of the International Monetary Order was decided. Or let me put it this way, a variety of schemes were put forward which would deliver some or more or less justice to the world other than the United States, but all of these were nixed. It is not true that at Bretton Woods, Keynes' plan failed and White plan won or anything like that. All of these things were nixed. And the de facto status quo that the dollar was being used was effectively enforced by the State Department in particular, which contained the people who were, basically, they said, well, we wanted the dollar to replace gold, to sterling after the First World War. We failed. Now we want a second chance. So these were the second chances, basically. Anyway, these guys managed to ensure that the dollar would remain the world currency, and they sweetened the bitter pill by saying that they would back it with gold. And at that time, the United States could do so because gold had fled Europe during the war. Now, there are many really interesting questions. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Germans have asked for their gold back. And we don't know where the gold is. And apparently, so some people, and by the way, we read all of this in little corners of the financial press, right? So we hear that actually the United States has used up the gold because they have been selling gold to keep up the price of the dollar. I don't know. I haven't checked. They won't let me in, So I can only read these little sections and pay attention to try and pay as much attention as I can to these matters.
Chavez got his gold back.
Sorry?
Chavez got
his gold back. But you see, Chavez was owed a tiny amount of gold. The Germans are owed a lot of gold. That's the difference. So, I think that the connection with oil is a very important one, and I have no doubt that there is a lot behind these stories that we read about why Iraq was invaded or why Libya was seen as Gaddafi was seen as such a threat. I have no doubt about that. I think that these are very true. What's more, the quadrupling of the price of oil in early 70s and then the later doubling of the price of oil, at least for a time, put a floor under the dollar. Because, everybody thinks, there is this expression, again, there are a whole host of ideas that are sort of companion ideas to the idea of US hegemony. One of them is benign neglect. We are told that the United States is effortlessly hegemonic. It doesn't have to bother about the value of the dollar because everybody wants the dollar, and this demand will keep the value of the dollar up. Well, and I actually show in my book that, quite frankly, it is not at all the case that Nixon actually bought this idea. He acted under completely other imperatives, simply the imperative of saving the US economy. But that's separate. But if you think about this, in reality, actually, even if there were some people in the United States who said, oh, well, now the link with the gold has been broken, the United States doesn't have to give away its gold anymore, this is wonderful, liberatory, etc., everything is going to be hunky-dory. This was not so. And neither central bank's demand for gold nor private demand for gold could hold up, dollar could hold up the dollar, and it plummeted. And the United States had to intervene in currency markets to hold up its value, at which point, precisely because the dollar was plummeting, OPEC said we are going to quadruple the price of oil because, quite frankly, the nominal price is no longer acceptable. The dollar is falling so rapidly in value that we must quadruple the price of oil, etc. Anyway, so, but once that was done, what Nixon did is, and this is very interesting from the point of view of everybody who thinks that the expansion of finance is a problem. At this point, they said we had to accept the quadrupling of the price of oil, but they then went to OPEC countries and said, why don't you recycle, why don't you deposit your surpluses in our banks? And of course, as a special incentive to do so, they also scuppered every attempt to provide alternatives to this arrangement, which the other countries, Europeans in particular, wanted to have because they were the most affected by this. They were the major importers of oil. They were just hit smack there by this quadrupling, and they were basically going to approach the OPEC countries and say, all right, if you must, can you at least lend us some money to buy? So this would have recycled the petrodollars in a very different way than in fact happened. Anyway, so all of these things were there, but even this did not last that long, because by the end of the 1970s, the dollar was headed south again. As I just said, the price of gold hit 850. But anyway, in that sense, the oil is the biggest trading commodity, and it does create a certain amount of demand for dollars. So as long as the oil trade remains denominated in dollars, then it does give some kind of a support to the dollar. Falling rate of profit. This is, of course, I mean, I personally, while I agree, I mean, I think that in the West, the rate of profit has been falling. There's a couple of things I would like to say about this. Number one, basically, there's maybe three things. Number one of the best historians of this matter is Robert Brenner, whose work I rely on a great deal in the writing of my book. And he points out that the rate of profit does not recover unless there is something which he calls slaughter of capital values. That is simply the destruction of a large amount, at least the value of capital, not necessarily the destruction of plant and machinery, but that can be part of it as well. And so I'm happy, and so what he's saying is that, Keynesian, or shall I say, mock Keynesian or false Keynesian means have been employed by governments who are not Keynesian, Reagan, Thatcher, etc., and many others, to prevent this from happening. Because, of course, in a competitive world, in a geopolitical economy of uneven and combined development, if you allow the slaughter of capital values in your own country, other countries benefit. So they may benefit because you are, it's a prisoner's dilemma sort of thing, where there's a collective logic and an individual logic, and the individual logic does not work. So what he says is that the crisis since the 70s has lingered, precisely because, with the exception of the UK, which must take the prize in sadomasochism, no other country has visited a 25% reduction in the share in its manufacturing sector, as Mrs. Thatcher did in the beginning of the 1980s. Okay, so it has continued. Keynes knew that this would. Keynes is somebody I pay a lot of attention to in a variety of different formats. And another one is that he pointed out that a time would come when there would indeed be way too much capital, at least for capital to start investing again. And at that point, he said something. A great socialization of investment will be important. I think that's where we're at. And that's where the alternative to austerity comes in. I think that we should all be talking about massive state investment, whether it is in housing, in green technology, in better schools and universities, whatever it is, better healthcare. I mean, all of these things are important things that people need. And I think it's important to argue for this and organize for this. So the point I want to make is that about the falling rate of profit is that at this point, capital is not going to invest. However, what capital wants to tell us is that unless we invest and get growth going again, you can't have growth. You can only get growth if we deign to give it to you. This is very problematic, and this is the key reason why we are constantly discussing the ins and outs of the most ineffectual monetary policy that has been pursued. Keynes also said this. They say you can recapitalize banks, but that is not going to get lending going again, because to get lending going again, you need borrowers. If I'm an industrialist, I need to feel that conditions are good enough for me to go and borrow, to invest, to create jobs, because I can realize, somebody mentioned realization, very important, so I can realize mine. Okay, so in all of these ways, so the point is that we are continuing discussing monetary policy and the entire purpose of all this ridiculous discussion of the tiniest details of monetary policy is to stop us from discussing fiscal policy, which is what is necessary. The state has to step in and do something. And if there's one message I can give, certainly for today, for now, for Britain against austerity, it's that. I think there are many, many other things that I really need, and I'll take up 2 or 3 things in the main. Military means substitute for economic means. Of course, that's what the United States has tried to do. However, again, when we discuss the United States military power, we always read off all those very impressive looking statistics. The United States spent more than any other country in the world, in fact more than all of them put together on its military. Apparently this was at one point true, it's no longer so. Perhaps the austerity is hitting America as well. And even the US Army, with the sequester actually, there are rumors that soldiers are going to be furloughed. So you're going to have young, well-trained men walking around the streets of the United States. They're going to be furloughed, being very angry. Watch out for that. Anyway, the point is that the United States spent a lot of money on its military in the years of which we are speaking. What did it do for them? They lost Vietnam. They lost against a nation of peasants. They lost even in Iraq. Okay, you can say in Vietnam they had the Soviet Union back in Iraq, there was no superpower backing the poor Iraqis. Afghanistan, what happened? You can buy all the toys that you like, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to demean the people who have suffered incredibly because of American weapons. They have. But what I'm saying is that in the end of the day, these weapons are not capable of setting up any kind of order that even the Americans can live with, let alone that would be good for Iraqis or good for Afghans or Vietnamese or whatever. So I think that it's very important to remember that it is easy to destroy and hard to build. Americans have been destroying a great deal, and we of course must put a stop to that. BRICS, very quickly. China, a couple of points. Number one, there is no guarantee that the BRICS will continue to grow. Only good economic policies will make them grow. And it is interesting that those BRICS are growing best, or those countries are growing best, which had, despite the more recent phase of relatively more neoliberal policies, in the past they had a substantial amount of state investment in their economies. This is how I explain, for example, India's continuing growth. It is because of that investment of the past, not because of the neoliberal policies of the present, which are actually creating a situation which, if left uncorrected, will mean that Indian growth is basically self-limiting. Okay? So because there has to be an expansion of Indian demand for Indian goods. And as long as we contribute to the world, as long as the Indians contribute to the world, the largest pool of the world's poor, it's not good. And this has to be rectified. So the growth is not guaranteed. China is going into Africa. I agree. I don't think that the Chinese are any more virtuous than, or any more vicious than any other country in the world. As long as there are relatively more powerful countries and relatively less powerful countries, we have to watch out for abuses and complain about them, criticize them, act against them. I think this is very important. Yes, however, it is because today there are far greater number of relatively powerful countries. They all must compete with each other in order to, so that today, in a sense, for the even poorer countries, the choices are greater, is what I'm trying to say. That if you're an African country, you can say, well, are the Chinese giving us a good deal, or are the Brazilians, or maybe even the Europeans? Because it will make everybody have to behave better, I think. This is part of the point. That is, when a lot of countries are competing, I'm not saying it's because of the goodness of their heart. Not at all. They will push, but I think that the hour, that this is what I mean by what is the hour in the history of imperialism. We have moved away now from even that phase when wars allowed America to attempt this sort of dominance. So in that sense, that's a very important thing. Morality. I think this point was a very important point, and I thank you for raising that. But I think it's very important to remember that at least in our time, as long as there are massive power differentials, and they still are, as the question about income inequalities raised, and I'll come to that in my last point, but as long there are going to be abuses, and in that context, the language of morality has typically been used by dominant countries to justify, like liberal interventions, humanitarian intervention. We are going to promote democracy, human rights, blah blah, etc. In reality, you are basically making a mess out of what were at least semi-viable economies and countries. And I think that humanitarian intervention is an extremely problematic ideology. I think one of the great gains made at the end of the Second World War was at least that in theory we accepted the equal sovereignty of countries. I think this is very important. And the so-called international community is again, as I say, a very problematic concept. And I think, yeah, anyway, I think I'll end with the point about inequality. And so I will say just the following. I think that basically, if you look very broadly at the history of poverty, inequality, etc., in the world as a whole, treating it as a single unit, which is something I refuse to do, but for the moment I will, because so much of the discourse is conducted as though the world were a single unit. Well, you see the following pattern. With the beginning of capitalism, you first begin to get an increase in inequality within countries, between ruling classes and working classes. Over time, however, you get increasing inequality between countries that overtakes inequality within countries for a short time. What's really interesting about this is basically the story of the post-war period. What happens in the post-war period? First world countries lose their colonies. What do they have to do as a result? They have to replace markets. What is the easiest way to replace markets? You've got to pay your workers a little bit more because you've got to increase consumption at home. Okay? And so that is primarily why inequalities between countries within countries in this period went down, but between countries went up. And this is Hajun Chang's, I don't know how many of you know, but he wrote a very fine book about a decade ago or so called Kicking Away the Ladder. His point was that the very policies of state-directed development that Western countries used in order to become rich, they are now denying under the guise of neoliberalism to the poor countries, right? This is precisely it. So then you were told these poor countries, oh, you should have more free play of markets and whatnot, but in reality, the point is that the only way in which you are going to reduce poverty in the world as a whole is if these poor countries become richer and therefore more productive. Richness only comes from being more productive, which is another reason why one should question these measures such as purchasing power parity, etc. Because all it does is it simply says the existing level of welfare is actually greater than you imagine on the basis of market exchange rates. But nothing has changed. You simply redefine an existing level of poverty to at least make it look to you like it's better. But the poor person you are measuring is just as poor as he or she always was. So now, a final point. I think that for China in particular, the industrialization and increasing productivity in China has indeed narrowed to some extent international inequalities. And I think that if other countries were to emulate that, it would be even wider. There is no other way. I think all of these Millennium Development Goals are not going to do anything to reduce the poverty of the poor people of third world countries. Yes, the elites of third world countries will do well, and they are doing well. We know that when we visit there, etc. But the point is that the only way in which the working people of any country do better is to increase the general level of production and productivity in that country, and for that, states are central. I think I can probably end.
If you want to buy the book, it's out.